In this lesson, we'll use some custom foliage brushes in conjunction with the clone stamp tool to paint moss onto our forest creature concept. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so our concept is coming along very nicely. In between lessons, I continue to bring in some more of that bark from those two images that we looked at in the previous lesson and just kind of started to weave those into the shoulder areas of our creature here. And that's looking really nicely, really starting to achieve that organic feel that we're shooting for. Again, he's kind of a creature of the earth in the way that I'm imagining him. So we want to continue on now by exploring a couple of additional textures and paint in some moss. All right, so let's go ahead and have a look at these textures. Okay, so we want to work in a couple of different types of moss. This texture here, which is actually, I think, of some grass, should work really nicely in also substituting for some kind of fine moss that will work in to our creature here. And then we have another example here of what will also work as just kind of a different variety of moss rather than just having one type. So we're going to kind of approach this much like we did when we were painting in that stone and concrete texture for the base skin, except this time we're going to use some different brush presets. So let's go ahead and jump back to our fine moss image. I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool, and instead of using just a soft round or hard round brush like before, I'm going to use another brush that actually comes included with Photoshop, and it's this little brush right here. It's the Spatter 27 pixels, okay? Let's go ahead and grab that. We'll size it up. You can kind of see the interesting shape that this brush preset has here, okay? So that's what we're going to use. It's going to allow us to very organically paint this moss. Now, before we begin doing that, I want to jump over to my brush panel here. Let's turn on scattering, and as you can see, that's reflected in the stroke there. And we can even push the amount of scatter just with that slider right there. So that feels about right for the time being, okay? Let's go ahead, hold down Alt and sample from our texture, okay? So once we've done that, you'll also notice over here in our layers panel, I've basically got 3 different layers we're going to be working on in this new group, which I've titled moss, all right? We'll start with kind of a finer moss, okay? Let's go ahead and kind of size this window down just a little bit. And I'm imagining, again, this creature as being very old, okay? And I'm thinking what really might add to the storytelling element of that is maybe giving him some sort of kind of goatee or beard made out of moss. How cool is that? So you can see we're sampling from that image. And so right now I'm just kind of very loosely kind of just trying to feel out how I want this moss to look. And periodically we'll want to kind of resample from our image so we're not hitting any hard edges of the perimeter of that image. So I'm just kind of working in these kind of some strands of hanging moss here, and you can kind of see, just kind of see the texture. And what I like about this particular brush is how it kind of scatters all that. So we're less likely to see a very repeated specific pattern that just stands out to our eyes. Okay? And we can vary up the size of our brush tip as we go. So just really at this point, I'm just kind of starting to block it in. Later on in the course, once we've got all of our textures pretty well blocked in, we're going to kind of analyze the image as a whole and really start to detail out everything kind of all together. But we're still in the texture blocking phase right now. Just kind of blocking all these in to really develop out the sketch, push it even further. So that's starting to look kind of cool. I'm liking how that's looking. Starting to kind of get a stronger visual for how this character will ultimately look. And we can continue around, kind of coming around to some different areas. He may have some just up on the top of his horns, kind of growing on that wood up there. I think that would be kind of cool. And what's great about this image that I'm referencing, it's not completely the same all the way across as far as values. We got a nice little bit of variety in there just with the values, and I think that also helps a little bit too, and just getting a little bit of variety kind of throughout as we paint in this moss. Might have a little bit over there as well. May want to kind of paint in some to kind of weave it in with some of these patches of bark that we have over here. That's feeling pretty nice. Let's go ahead and try that second type of moss. And this time I want to use a different preset to kind of scatter very organically in as we paint. So I'm going to come down here towards the bottom, and I've actually added some custom brush presets that I've made for another course where we focus on creating custom foliage brushes. So here they are just towards the bottom here, and these will actually be included as a separate ABR file if you want to play around with them. But basically we have just some different types of leaves, grass, we even have some bark, and so feel free to kind of play around with these and use any one of them on your own concept or this concept if you're following along. I'm actually going to use this one right here as I think it'll work very nicely. But first what I want to do is double check the settings, and I just want to make sure I have scattering on there. You can kind of see how it looks just in the stroke right there. So I'm going to use this, I might size it up just a little bit more, and we're going to sample, and I'm going to jump over here onto our larger moss layer. I want to kind of keep these different types of moss just a little bit separated. And I'm just going to kind of start to paint that in. You can kind of see just kind of how it looks there. Kind of a nice variety of basically foliage that we're kind of weaving into our creature here. I think that works really nicely just with that different texture that we have. So again, kind of continuing to sample. And we're just kind of starting to work that in just in some different areas. He may even have a little bit built up just kind of on the underside of his horn, which is gross. So just kind of starting to think about that. Just some different areas that we can start to weave this in. Now I'm noticing that there's some areas where I might want to adjust the values again. May want to use an adjustment layer, kind of like we've done before, and just kind of adjust the overall values of some of this moss. But we'll kind of take care of that kind of towards the end of the lesson. So we may have a little bit kind of coming up here, kind of right around this area, kind of growing up into kind of his neck and shoulder area. And that's looking pretty cool. Kind of zooming out there, just kind of looking at everything as a whole. I'm liking how that's looking. So we can kind of continue to come back to that particular type of moss as well. You'll notice I have another layer where I want to paint in some actual moss, okay? So this will be pretty cool. Let me kind of shrink that window down just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and right-click and just use another one of these custom foliage brushes that I have here. I'm going to go ahead and try out this leaf brush right here, as I think it'll work nicely. And as you can see, it's just an arrangement of leaves. And you'll notice, and I cover this in our course where we talk about creating these brushes, how I have all the stems basically designed to be pointing inward. And that makes a big difference in the believability of that brush as you paint with it. So definitely check out that course if you really want to know more about how I crafted and designed these different brushes. And so what I want to do now is actually, let's go ahead and switch to our brush tool. We'll use that same brush. And I'm just going to basically paint in a silhouette of some hanging moss. So we're going to just kind of start off with that first before we start incorporating any kinds of texture. So you can kind of see how it faintly scatters it. And we can make it larger if we want. It's just kind of some hanging vines, hanging moss. Just something like that. It feels like it's been growing on him for a while. And we're just kind of starting to kind of block that in. Now this area right here might be pretty well in shadow where it's hanging. So later on we'll kind of come back to it and start to kind of block in, weave in some of this moss texture into just some of these hanging areas as well. So that's kind of looking cool. I'm thinking about these protruding areas over here. We'd probably definitely have a little bit of this hanging growth coming off of it. I think that would be kind of neat. So again, having brushes like this can really prove useful, especially using them with some textures, using them with your clone stamp tool. Just provides another creative way to basically paint in, weave in some textures, rather than just using the default hard round, soft round, or any of the other default Photoshop brushes. Having some custom ones can work as well. But keep in mind there are a lot of great brushes in Photoshop that you can use for this, which we started out with using that spatter brush. That worked very nicely, I thought, and kind of laying in some of that kind of finer moss. Let's go ahead and kind of finish out this lesson by focusing on maybe adjusting kind of the values of that larger moss. We may want to go ahead and try an adjustment layer once again. So just kind of coming down here to the bottom, we may want to just adjust the brightness and contrast of that layer. Again, just kind of clipping that so it only affects that layer. We may want to kind of bring the brightness down. Could kind of adjust the contrast too if we want. And what's cool again is you can always come back in there and adjust those sliders. But if there's some areas we feel are a little bit too dark, we can actually, using black and our brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and enable transfer for that particular brush. We can paint black on that white mask and kind of reveal that some of those lighter areas that we had before. So if we don't want to have that adjustment layer affect everything, we can easily do that. So kind of a neat little trick, to where we're not ready to make complete destructive edits to any of this moss just yet. We haven't collapsed down everything into one merged copy, which we'll do much later on. We're going to eventually collapse all these textures that we have and just kind of mesh them all together and really kind of get in there and start to really tweak and detail and kind of do some additional painting later on. So in between lessons, I'm going to continue to just kind of start to weave in and tweak some of this moss onto our forest protector, our forest creature, whatever you want to call him. But in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and shift gears and add another earth-like element to our creature here. And we're going to start focusing on bringing in some rocks and some rock textures. And we might even adjust the overall form of some areas of the head here. So stick around and we'll see you in that lesson.